Hey everyone, James here. Thank you everyone for leaving all those good comments and stuff like that. Really appreciate hearing from fellow fans of Italian genre cinema. Definitely some of my favorite stuff, and definitely a bit of a niche topic. Not going to meet a whole lot of people locally that are into this stuff, so always a pleasure to connect with different people online and stuff. So not that a lot of people have commented so far, but I do very much appreciate the few that have. Definitely this is passion project more than anything else, so I've never expected to get much of an audience or anything like that, so really do appreciate the people that do tune in however, so thank you everyone. So today, going to be talking about Nothing Underneath. And this is actually the first episode I filmed in a while. I filmed a bunch of these back in April, and then I actually had the pleasure of going to Europe for a couple weeks. So I'm just coming back, and I have been mainlining a lot of 1980s Giallo. Since I've gotten back, going to be doing kind of a 1980s Gialli episode, just kind of summarizing, talking about a few of my favorites within that sort of sphere. So this is one of those that I rewatched, and I don't think this is the best, or probably even close to the best. Maybe it's in the top 7 1980s Giallo, but I do think this is the most 1980s Giallo, and in some ways kind of the ultimate expression of that. And that film that I'm going to be talking about today is Nothing Underneath from 1985, so right smack dab in the middle of the 1980s. So let me explain a little bit of what I'm talking about when I say this is the most 1980s Gialli. So this film was done by two brothers, Carlo Vanzina and Enrico Vanzina. Like many of these Italian directors, they came from a filmmaking family. Their father, Stefano Vanzina, Steno, as he is often credited, did a lot of films, most of which I have not seen. I think the majority comedies, I think, is what he's known for. But he did direct one of the seminal Eurocrime films, and a personal favorite of mine, Execution Squad. So I do recommend that film if you are curious about sort of the Polizioteschi Eurocrimes, but that's an aside. So these two brothers kind of came in. They directed a Giallo Mistero in 1983. Pretty solid, a little bit forgettable 1980s Giallo affair. Very glad to have it, but, it's not going to be winning any awards whatsoever. And then they did this in 1985, and then they actually did one of the more recent Giallos in 2011 that I did see and was not very good. So they did this right smack dab in the middle of the 1980s, and I think most Giallo fans would consider this to be their main contribution to the Giallo genre. And it's easy to see why. The film is very, very entertaining and enjoyable. It's also very 1980s, as you might not be surprised to hear. It has a score by Pino Donaggio that sounds eerily similar to Body Double. You can side by side the scores, and you'll see that I don't know if this was on behest of the Vanzina brothers, or if Donaggio just pulled a fast one on them. I don't particularly mind, as it's kind of a fun score, but it definitely sounds very, very similar. But the hairstyles, the clothing, it kind of has that familiar trope of having sort of this big group of people, and one of them is probably going to be the killer, which is kind of a reoccurring Giallo trope. That honestly harkens all the way back to Blood and Black Lace, way back in the early to mid 60s. And so this one also has a model troupe, the same as Blood and Black Lace. So in many ways, this film is kind of like the updating of that familiar trope all the way into the 80s. 80s, just a very different decade than the 1960s. And so it just feels a whole lot different. Like, you wouldn't ever compare this film directly with Blood and Black Lace. The films just are night and day between each other, even if they kind of take that very familiar Giallo template and just update it in this version. So I think the best Giallos of the 1980s are kind of directed by the big directors of Giallos. So you have your Dario Argentos, and then you have kind of his two proteges who both did a couple works during the 1980s. Michele Soavi, who did Stage Fright, and Lamberto Bava, who actually did a handful of Giallos in the 1980s too. Soavi and Bava and Argento always just has a very distinct feel to it. So I feel like his films, even even in his heyday, perhaps the exception being the Animal trilogy, because they were so mimicked, always have kind of a different feel to them, in my opinion, than kind of your mainline Giallo films. And his 1980s output certainly is different. Like Tenebrae is a very atypical Giallo. I would say Opera is as well. We can even debate whether Phenomena is a Giallo or not. And I feel like Suavi and Lamberto Bava kind of take after Mr. Dario and sort of have a very distinct, unique feel to it. And Fulci, who also did some good work in the 80s, but his two outputs were The New York Ripper and Murder Rock. Notice something about those. They're both set in New York, and they're both pretty different as a result. So as a result, I feel like these aren't really that updating of that Giallo formula. Not that you can't have Giallo set abroad, they just have a very, very different feel. So that's why I would say something like this kind of falls directly into that ultimate 1980s Giallo, down from the style and stuff like that to the Milan model setting. Which is fantastic. I mean, as always in these films, the score and the locations can do a lot of work in terms of just getting you there. There are strengths and weaknesses to a lot of these Italian genre films. Probably the bigger weaknesses some people are going to pick up on, and it'll bother them more, such as narrative stuff, or kind of the lackadaisical leads. The lead in this film is no exception, but it makes up for it with a lot of settings and styles and stuff like that. Okay, so is this film good? I think this film is legitimately very, very good. It's pretty clear from watching this that the two brothers watched a lot of Brian De Palma in preparation from this. Not just the score, but the way the camera flows and moves and stuff like that. It's definitely more in that thriller mode rather than kind of going and pushing the limits in some of your sleazy, more lurid tones, stuff that was actually pretty common for kind of these late-stage Giallo films to go, notably stuff like Giallo in Venice, Play Motel. A bunch of those films really were pushing the limits of kind of good taste. New York Ripper to some extent too. But in this film, not really doing that. Just pretty content to be a thriller. The kills are violent, but they're not overly violent compared to the norm. And it's not super, super sleazy like some of those Giallos could get too. So I tend to be a little neutral on those things. I can enjoy it, some sleaze under the right context, but it's not the reason that I do watch these films too. This film is also very, very polished and cut together well. I feel like the directors as well as the editor really did study the De Palma films and saw how they work. It uses a good sense of misdirection in a couple of the fights and just does a very good job of drawing it out. Which really makes it feel quite suspenseful and definitely more of that thriller vein. Doesn't feel like a body count film either. At this point, 1985, kind of that slasher boom in the US had happened too. So some of these Giallos, I think Stage Fright is probably the one that feels the most slashery. This film doesn't. This film feels like a De Palma thriller crossed with a Giallo. So, going back to the premise too. The basic premise is a park ranger from Wyoming whose twin sister is a fashion model in Milan, Italy, strongly senses that his sister is in mortal danger. That's a totally bonkers presence, and that's a very accurate summation of kind of the driving plot of the movie. So, I mean, if you're not familiar with the Italian genre films, this will sound ridiculous. For people that are into that stuff like myself, it sounds very much right up that alley. This was a very big hit at the time, and oddly enough, Dario Argento did not like it. I'm not exactly sure why that would be, but, I mean, it could be a little bit of professional jealousy, or maybe it's just not the sort of Giallo that he tended to like. Vinegar Syndrome just recently released a Blu-ray for it, so I actually did see the nice print on Tubi, which I think is the restored copy. I'd previously seen this a couple of years ago, and the quality is just so much better, so I really did enjoy that. It was released in tandem with sort of its spiritual sequel, not done by the Vanzina brothers, but by Dario Pina, something like that, who was a music video director. So that film also, I think it's very well worth watching, has a lot of style. Might talk about that later too. So yeah, that one is also a very 1980s Giallo. I think this film is a touch better. I would definitely start out with this film. But if you do enjoy this film, Too Beautiful to Die is definitely worth checking out too. Okay, so why is this film not perfect? I think a lot of it just kind of comes down to the lead being pretty imperfect. He is not exactly oozing charisma or something like that. The nice thing about this, though, is we are blessed with kind of a very committed performance from Donald Pleasance, who is just who gets these frankly throwaway trashy roles of like police inspectors and stuff like that, and just brings a lot of you're just immediately drawn to him, and he just has such a strong screen presence to him that it's nice to have someone like that in this film, because without him there's not a lot of exactly super strong acting performances that are able to really carry this film. And I think that's probably the number one complaint I would have with this film, is like the lead and stuff like that. It's not exactly it's not exactly the next coming of Marlon Brando or anything like that. So a couple other things that make this film very distinctly Giallo is the urban setting, of course, the streets of Milan and stuff like that. There's some great kind of traversing through Milan, a lot of it quite suspenseful at night, so I like all that. It very much has that feel of that kind of like De Palma-ish voyeuristic thriller, kind of like a descendant of that Hitchcock DNA going on there. There's also touches of Eyes of Laura Mars and Fury, so kind of that like psychic connection going on there. Of course, in the Giallo vein, we have the psychic and Deep Red, so things like psychic connections and stuff like that, not totally foreign to Giallo. I would say this is not exactly supernatural in the sense of like Fury or something like that. It just has kind of a touch of that. So not totally over the top bonkers like phenomena, but you can very much watch this film as a Giallo with a little bit of goofiness to it too, rather than a totally supernatural film. Let's see, what else is there? So yeah, again, I really like the way that a couple of the scenes, especially the second kill, happens where we're just held in suspense for a long time, where you think you're going to see the killer, and it just plays a lot with that, and it's just so well edited and polished and put together. So even if this is like a lower rate De Palma knockoff, I'm still all on board for that kind of stuff too. There's a Russian roulette scene later, kind of shows the symbolism of that time, in the sense of like the excess of money and materialism. One could say capitalism to some extent too. And there's a really beautiful finale with slow motion and stuff like that too. So there's a lot to like in this film. Unfortunately, I did see this film a couple weeks ago, intending to talk about it and record back then, but I just didn't have the time at that moment. So unfortunately, the film is not quite as fresh as I would have preferred in my memory. But I didn't want to watch it again, so I apologize. Okay, so who won the movie? I guess I'll give it to Donald Pleasance and his Wendy's scene, where he eats a plate of spaghetti and Wendy's. Very bizarre scene, but just gonna give it to him. I could very well easily give it to the Vanzina brothers. I probably should, but that's just a fun bonkers scene. And yeah, this film is just fun. Is it great? No. Is it high art? Definitely not. But it is a lot of fun. Rating wise, coming in at 7.5 out of 10. Just a rock solid recommendation. If you are someone that is into Giallos, this is definitely a must check out, I would say. I'd say it is a little bit above average as far as like just kind of the whole canon of Giallos go. And as far as 1980s Giallos go, I consider this the ultimate one. So let me know what you think. Let me know what Giallos from the 1980s you like. What do you consider to be the most 1980s Giallo too? So thank you all for tuning in. I will see y'all next time.